Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got another preview episode of the podcast today. We are recording this on Thursday afternoon, getting ready for the SEC Championship game. Number 2, Texas. Number 5, Georgia, 4 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC. Going to be a heck of a game down in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And to help us preview it, we've got Horns 24/7's Eric Henry back on the show. Second time this season to talk a little Dogs Longhorns. Eric, how is today going for you? And does it really feel like it's only been 6 weeks since we did this? I swear it feels like it was several months, just as long as this season's been.
Well, first off, Jordan, appreciate you having me on. As always, a pleasure to be back on the show with you. And you talk about it, right? Especially, for guys like us who have that football, basketball overlap. I know we're joking in the pre-show about signing day. It feels like we've lived 4 lives since the last time these two teams have met. But here we are. And hey, Jordan, this might not be the last time we do this, right?
No, I think you're absolutely right. We were actually talking about that on the Junkyard message board today. We might as well just become co-hosts, Eric. The way this is poised and could play out. But
here's the thing: if we're going to be co-hosts, I got to get a sweet 24/7 polo. Like I got to get one of those. If we're going to make this official, then I've got to invest in some 24/7 gear.
I'm going to make some calls when we get off of this. I'll promise you that. Well, I know a lot of folks are interested in seeing this Texas team again, and it's a little different to do a preview for the second time, but at the same time, they've played 5 games since Georgia and Texas played, and I want to start with the last one Texas played. All eyes, especially when it came to Georgia fans, were on that Texas A&M game on Saturday. Texas wins 17-7. What stood out to you, Eric, about that win for Texas? What you thought was especially impressive with how they were able to get the job done?
Mike Elko referred to it in his postgame as being physically annihilated. Now, Jordan, I wouldn't consider this Texas team to be a finesse or soft or anything like that, However, the way they've played football this year hasn't necessarily looked in a myriad of ways like the way they played football last year. Last year's group was spearheaded on defense by T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, and Jalen Ford. Those, stalwarts up the middle of the defense. They just impose their will and scream physicality, right? Toughness. Then you flip to the offensive side of the ball, and it was Jonathan Brooks in the run game that really opened things up for the pass game with the dynamic talents of Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, and others on the outside for Quinn Ewers. This year, it's been a little bit reverse for the majority of the year. One of the things that I asked Steve Sarkisian about was the fact that he was throwing the ball really early in games. And that was the case when these two teams met. They came out throwing the football. And Steve Sarkisian said, hey, each year is going to look a little bit different. And he referred back to his time, being a native Californian and watching Bill Walsh offenses, right? How they would throw early, use the kind of the short and shallow passing game as an extension of the run to build a lead and then close games out with the run. Well, if you had told me that 5-6 weeks after the way Georgia came into Austin, and let's just call a spade, physically imposed themselves on Texas, that 5-6 weeks later, this team would be able to go into College Station and physically annihilate A&M. That, to me, was the biggest takeaway. Now, of course, the way they did that was with the run game. And I know we'll get into this a little bit, so I won't belabor the point too much. But if you want to talk about one of the biggest differences between this team when they played on October 19th and now, it's how consistent the run game is. So I'll pause it there because I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of that coming up.
Well, we can go ahead and jump into it. I mean, their numbers have been very impressive, especially down the stretch. What do you think has been working for this run game, and what has been markedly different than, like we said, the first time around with these two teams?
I would go back and forth with Steve Sarkisian. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this the first time around on the pod, that the run game, if my memory serves me correct, entering the October 19th game, Texas was ranked, I believe, 58th in the nation in rushing. Averaging something like 189 yards per game. Certainly numbers that, you're not going to, all teams would take $189 on the ground per game. However, if you took a look at the chunk plays, the 3 longest runs were from non-running backs, right? You had a 55-yard reverse play by Ryan Wingo. You had a 67-yard zone read by Arch Manning. Then you also had a 43-yard play from Isaiah Bond, right? They were getting a lot of chunk plays, but it was kind of coming in, again, let's just call a spade, like non-traditional ways. Texas's ability to just line up, run the football, consistently pick up 4 or 5 yards a pop wasn't there outside of, really Jaden Blue's performance against Mississippi State. No disrespect to the Bulldogs, but they certainly left a lot to be desired defensively. So what's changed, and it's really been over the last 3 weeks, Quintravian Wisner, the emergence of him in the backfield. Blue is a guy who, and I guess I should backtrack here for a minute, Jordan. There was sort of a feeling amongst Texas fans, excuse me, that when, you go from Bijan Robinson to Roschon Johnson and Roschon Johnson to Jonathan Brooks, and the assembly line of backs is just going to keep going because you have a veteran offensive line. You have a really talented position coach in Tashard Choice, and the expectations are high around here in Austin on the 40 acres. Now, you lose C.J. Baxter in fall camp to a knee injury, and I think the expectation was, all right, Jaden Blue's a guy who showed promise. He's a home run hitter, showed promise at the end of 2023 when Jonathan Brooks went down. He'll just step in. And there is a natural adjustment process, I think, for not only the running backs to be the full-time guy behind an offensive line, but the offensive line kind of blocking for said back, right? We saw that last year when Jonathan Brooks stepped in for C.J. Baxter and the run game took off. It was much of the same, just much later in the season this year, Jordan, where it was hit or miss. Sometimes it would look horrendous. Sometimes you'd get a little bit here or there, see some flashes. Quintravian Wisner emerges as the full-time guy, and he has been outstanding over the last 3 weeks. I had the number on top of my head. Now I don't anymore, but I think Trey ran for 186 against A&M, and I believe 153 or 154 the week before against Kentucky. So, over 300 and something yards on the ground, and just get that consistent yardage. When everyone in the stadium knows, those 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 4s, turn around, hand the ball off, they can do that. And something that I think will be crucial for Texas this time around is they're winning on early downs. They're putting themselves up. They're setting themselves up in situations to convert, those 3rd down situations. So that's kind of been the big difference. Long-winded answer to kind of tell you, Quintravian Wisner's emergence has really helped shape things in the backfield.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that is going to be one of the matchups, and one of the things Georgia has to do is try to slow him down, because not only has he been running well, but Georgia's looking at a situation where I don't know that defensive tackle Christian Miller is going to be able to come back for this game. He got hurt against UMass. He's one of their best run stuffers. So having to do that, trying to slow down Wisner without having him, that is going to be a huge test for this Georgia defense. I want to ask you too, Eric, it's funny kind of looking back to this first meeting, with at the time Quinn Ewers was coming back. I think that was his 2nd game coming back from injury. There were questions about him. Obviously not the day that he wanted against Georgia, but how have you seen him play in these last few games? And just what do you think about where he is, I guess, both physically and mentally going into this SEC title game?
It's been a seesaw, last few weeks, but it's been a seesaw season for Quinn Ewers. The guy who led his team into Michigan, threw 3 touchdown passes, looked like that was going to be the jumping off point for his Heisman Trophy candidacy. He hasn't quite been that guy since the abdominal injury that, of course, was suffered against UTSA. And when he, as you talked about, that was the 2nd game back. The first start back was Oklahoma, and even then was a little bit disjointed in terms of getting things going. Eventually, because Texas has been a much better team than Oklahoma this year, they took care of things going in the 2nd quarter and ran away with that game 34-3. But his seesaw play is kind of continued. I mean, you see the highs, the 5 touchdown performance against Florida, right? Like, those are the type of things you think, okay, Quinn Ewers might be turning the corner, he's getting his health back. But then it kind of, I hate to use this word, but inexplicably, you go to Arkansas against a team that struggled against the pass all year, and the offense looks completely disjointed. Arkansas deploys 3 high safety look, and Texas, quite frankly, struggled with that, trying to get the ball downfield. They were able to pressure Quinn Ewers a lot. So when you take away the things that are downfield, and then when you're getting pressured, we know what that can do to an offense. So not all of it, Jordan, is on Quinn. Again, I mean, some of it is just kind of the way that the offense is shaking out. But I do believe, and I hate to be repetitive, but especially with the emergence of the run game, it's not that Texas can't throw early and have success, right? They did that in a lot of games this year. I just feel like that's too hard of an expectation, too tough of an ask against a Georgia team that is going to be physical, which regardless of whether this is a Georgia defense of years past, still a very talented Georgia defense. I think that's a lot because we saw what happened on October 19th. If you don't get those early completions, all of a sudden you're in, 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8. Georgia can pin their ears back, rush the passer, and all of a sudden the game gets away from you quickly. And also that, then, if you're getting sacked, right, then you start getting to the field position aspect of the game, which Texas clearly lost on October 19th.
Yeah, it was pretty wild, just the disparity in field position. And it was huge in Georgia being able to win that one 30-15. Eric, when you look at the rest of this offense, we mentioned Wisner. Are there other guys you feel like who have sort of broken out or taken on bigger roles since mid-October when Georgia last saw Texas?
Yeah, I'll wrap a couple of guys, and I'll start with the offensive line. I mean, I noted this in my Q&A with you. Cam Williams is someone who, in terms of just being a blocker at right tackle, has had a really good first year stepping in, of course, with the graduation of Christian Jones. The issue with him leading into the October 19th game was penalties. At that point in time, he was tied for the nation's lead in penalties by an offensive lineman. He's still second, if my memory serves me correct, but he hasn't committed a penalty over the last 3 games. So kind of his settling into his role as a starting right tackle and not, doing some of those things that would put Texas behind the chains, most notably false starts, right? Like those things can't happen, especially at home. So I'm going to shout him out. Trevor Gooseby is a name that Georgia fans should know only because Kelvin Banks on the first availability report came out as questionable. We're all expecting that KB will play, but if for some reason KB doesn't, or it's, a short stint there at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Trevor Gooseby is the redshirt freshman left tackle that stepped in at A&M, almost at Mississippi State, at A&M, 7 plays into the game, doesn't allow a sack, doesn't allow a pressure. So he's a name to know. And then as far as the skill position guys, we talked about Contravon Wisner already, but a name that I wouldn't necessarily say is an emergence, but you need to know again, Gunnar Helm and Matt Golden. I mean, Gunnar Helm has been one of the top tight ends in the nation, a guy who's going to work the middle of the field, sneaky athletic, can make plays downfield, but Matt Golden has kind of emerged. I don't want to say the go-to guy in this offense because Isaiah Bond struggled with some injuries, and really this year there hasn't been one go-to guy. It's kind of been, receiver by committee, but Matt Golden, especially down there on the goal line, he's kind of emerged as that touchdown guy, kind of the A.D. Mitchell of last year, from last year's team. So those are all names that I would say, at least from the offensive side of the ball, to get to know.
Flipping over to the defense, Texas still playing really well, 11.7 points per game allowed. What have you thought of the defensive efforts in these last few weeks, and who, especially toward the end of the season, has really stood out to you?
Yeah, you talk about the 11.7 points per game allowed. I'll even go deeper than that. You take a look over the last 5 weeks, allowing only 8.5 points per game when you subtract the turnovers, of course, a couple of pick sixes that were on Quinn Ewers. And the offense is, to turn the ball over, only allowing 8.5 points. This defense is still playing lights out. And I know the major knock against them, Jordan's been, okay, well, they haven't played anybody. They didn't play LSU, didn't play Bama, didn't play Tennessee, so on and so forth, right? But you can't look at the level with which they're playing and say anything other than this has been a great defense, even against Georgia. You take a look at the 30 points that were allowed. We talked about it in the first half. How many of those were on short fields, right? To expect that defense to hold up that well against a top 5, top 10 team in the nation is a really tough ask. So they've continued to perform well. I would say since the last time these two teams have met, the biggest change has been the emergence of additional playmakers, second line guys. Your starters on the edge, Trey Moore and Barron Sorrell. Trey Moore wasn't really finding his footing, hadn't really found his footing the first time these two teams played. This time around, he's playing really good football. He's gotten a couple sacks under his belt. He's making some plays behind the line of scrimmage. So Steve Sarkisian has been high on Trey Moore throughout the entirety of the season. So he's kind of emerged as an additional playmaker. Colin Simmons, someone who was second on this team in sacks, emerged as an additional playmaker. You take a look at the secondary, Jelani McDonald, someone who wasn't a starter. Andrew McCool, of course, got banged up the first time these two teams met, and Jelani McDonald has stepped in and now become an additional playmaker in the secondary with the safety rotation. So you're going to see him. But then the standouts have been the standouts. Jahdae Barron, in my mind, is the best defensive back in football. He's continued to play great football. Look no further than his performance at Arkansas: 7 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, a sack, an interception, a fumble recovery. So he's playing great football. And Anthony Hill, is someone who is going to be a playmaker behind the line of scrimmage.
I think it was on Sunday someone asked Steve Sarkisian about how confident this secondary is, if they're more confident than compared to the first time against Georgia. And he said, I don't know about that, but what do you think of how the secondary has been playing in recent weeks?
Yeah, the thing is they've been consistent all the way through. And just kind of taking a 10,000-foot view, Jordan, that's really, if you compare last year's defense to this, That's been the biggest difference. Is last year you could point to the secondary and say, okay, that's a weak link. Jaron Thompson, who's now with Auburn, Jalen Catalon with UNLV, Keaton Crawford with Nevada. those guys, solid players, missed a lot of tackles when receivers got the ball. And just for whatever reason, it just was disjointed. Even, Ryan Watts, now in the NFL, struggled with injuries. Terrence Brooks with Illinois was up and down. The complete revamping of this secondary, starting with moving Jahdae Barron off of the star position, that nickel slot corner, moving him outside to cornerback, which allowed Jalen Gilbo, someone who actually was the starter as a true freshman in 2022 before he got banged up with a knee injury, that allowed him to get back in the lineup. And then, as I mentioned, Andrew Makuba getting someone who was a freshman All-American from Clemson, revamping it around him. Michael Taff is a guy who we don't talk about enough. He gets – Jordan, we've done this long enough. Guys get hit with that label, that walk-on label, right? And we tend to not view them through, or I should say not view them, but they never outgrow that label, right? We always view them through the walk-on status and like, oh, he's just gritty and tough and does whatever it takes. And Taft is all of those things, but he's also a really good coverage safety that he's emerged into, right? So that's someone as well you got to keep an eye on. So yeah, this secondary, I don't necessarily know if they're playing, better than they were entering October 19th. However, they have had additional playmakers. Kobe Black is a true freshman that you'll probably see on Saturday situationally. So just more playmakers that have emerged, and just the revamping of the secondary as it's allowed for, outstanding play for Pete Kwiatkowski's unit.
You mentioned walk-ons, Eric. If there's a program to cover where you can't write those guys off, it's Georgia, because they've had a bunch of them. Dan Jackson made a lot of plays. Cash Jones, a guy from Brock, Texas, had a touchdown in overtime of that Georgia Tech game. So, yeah, you got to be careful when you talk about walk-ons, because, man, these programs know how to find them and make the most of them.
No, most definitely.
I want to ask you, too, before we take a break, I'm trying to remember, did Bill Norton make a big play in that A&M game? He's a guy that Georgia fans are still following from his days as a Bulldog.
No, Bill Norton was certainly in on a couple of run stuffs. Most notably, you take a look at that goal line stand. I believe it was the Texas A&M's penultimate drive of the game there, about 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter, when Omari Daniels, 3 straight times, they started at the 2, ended up going backwards, get stuffed. So Bill Norton was in on those run stuffs for sure.
Just going to take a quick break and come back and talk specifically about Saturday's matchup, what the folks in Austin are saying about this game, and how we expect this thing to play out. I'll tell the folks who are watching this live on YouTube or on Facebook, hey, drop your score predictions in the comments. I'll rattle off as many of them as I see when we get to that, probably about 10 minutes. But Eric, what's the conversation been like this week when it comes to getting ready for this? Texas' first season in the SEC, a win away from winning the SEC. What sort of stood out to you about what Steve Sarkisian, what these players have had to say about this game and another rematch against Georgia?
As cliche as it sounds, they've been consistent about, we're not going to make too much of this game. Every game is an SEC championship game. And that's really the mantra they took ever since Texas lost to Georgia, again, 5-6 weeks ago. They felt that, hey, if we're going to get another shot, then we can't lose. We have to treat every game like it is an SEC championship game. And just to kind of let, your viewers and listeners, people who will hear this, peek behind the curtain. That's been Texas' thing for the past 2 years, right? When they lost to Oklahoma last year in the Red River Shootout, their mantra was every game is a Big 12 title game, right? In order to get an opportunity to play for a Big 12 title, which of course they eventually did and won. So it's been the same mantra. They're not making too much of the fact that, they're playing in this game. It just more so was like, hey, this was a preseason goal and now we're here and we have the chance to achieve it. But with that being said, if we broaden it out and, kind of take a look from the Texas fan base, they certainly are excited that in year one, they're playing for an SEC championship. It was one of those things, I was asked this question earlier this week on a radio hit. I can't remember where. And, it may have been Sirius SEC with Chris Doring and Alyssa Lang. And they asked the question, how important was it that Texas is playing in the SEC title game year one? And, I've kind of gone back and forth on this because I looked at the program that Texas was really kind of building, right? If you take a look at this roster, and of course, it's kind of fitting that we're coming off a signing day doing this episode. It's built big on the interior, big in the trenches in the offensive line, fast in the skill positions, built like an SEC team. And you could say that even going back to last year. Now, of course, that's kind of been enhanced a little bit. You get guys like Anthony Hill, you get speed at the linebacker. No disrespect to Jalen Ford, who's one of my favorite players to cover here at Texas, but A. Hill's a different level of athlete than Jay Ford. And even Jay Ford was a pretty athletic guy, right? So you get that kind of speed on the outside. Colin Simmons off the edge, arguably the fastest first step in the nation. You're talking about a kid who's 18, 19 years old, those instinctive pass rushing type of things. So the reason why I didn't think it necessarily was, wholly crucial, Jordan, was I just looked at the roster they were building. And if they didn't get here this year, I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't get there. And I know that sounds a little bit brazen, a little bit presumptive, considering the fact that Texas had gone, how many years between making Big 12 titles. I just would say the teams of those years and the teams that Steve Sarkisian are building, vastly different. Now, with that being said, the fact that they are here, of course, the emphasis is, hey, let's go win it. The same thing that other sports at UT Athletics have been able to do. But I do think just from a football perspective, to kind of shut down the all, is Texas SEC ready? And of course, had Texas, not made this game, I guess the conversation would have been, well, they aren't SEC ready, right? They can't handle the gauntlet of an SEC schedule, and they didn't get even quote unquote, the meat of the SEC schedule in terms of some of those premier top tier teams. At least you shut down that conversation by making the title game. And we'll see what happens if they can win it. Then you certainly answer all those questions there.
I want to see, Eric, if you think it's as funny as I do that, coming out of media days out in Dallas, this was the prediction was Georgia, Texas was the popular prediction. And we get here and, let's imagine someone who was in a coma and missed all this and they wake up and they're like, oh, well, I'm sure this season went exactly like we all expected in the SEC. Pretty crazy season with all the upsets and Vanderbilt pulling down teams and stuff like that. But, we still wind up with where we thought we would be with the Longhorns and the Bulldogs meeting again in Atlanta.
Yeah, it is funny that you frame it that way, Jordan, because again, it's so funny, right? So Texas comes in 11-1, obviously Georgia comes in 10-2. I guess if you just looked at those records on paper, you would say, like you said, all right, the season went about as planned. Obviously Georgia had a hiccup here or there that was unexpected. But then you look at the season totality and you understand, how many teams, Alabama at one point in time, was in the driver's seat in this league. And it looked like Tennessee or Ole Miss or some other teams might really push and be in the driver's seat. Texas is the only one in my mind. And again, it was a great performance by Georgia coming into Austin and winning. I said this to you on, we talked earlier this week. I don't feel that either of these two teams played their A game. And I think that's the thing that kind of leaves you that little bit of pause. It's like, hey, let's see what this matchup looks like when both teams put forth something that even resembles their A game. We saw, facets of it on different sides of the ball, but we didn't get quite that slugfest. Both teams really, performing at a high level. So that really, to me, I think is the major takeaway from this is this entire year, it's kind of been disjointed in the league and teams are capable, susceptible of a loss, in any given week. What can it look like when both these teams now are here in Atlanta, have plenty of time to prepare for each other, have faced each other before? What can it look like on Saturday?
It's going to be fascinating. And like you said, for me, looking at Georgia's performance in that first meeting, best game of the year for the defense, but offense, Carson Beck throws 3 interceptions, but they took advantage of those short fields, as we've talked about a few different times. Now, Eric, you mentioned Kelvin Banks and his situation. Are there other injury situations to keep an eye on? And I want to say again, for people who might be listening to this on game day, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon Eastern time. Just so there might be more developments by the time this game gets underway. But besides Kelvin Banks, are there any other injury situations to keep an eye on?
No, Texas is a relatively healthy team outside of the guys who were lost in the early part of the year. Of course, CJ Baxter, Christian Clark, and others. This team has been relatively healthy. So Kelvin Banks will be the one to keep an eye on. There were a couple guys who had been banged up at certain points. DeAndre Moore, Mo Blackwell, Moore being the Texas slot receiver, really key person in some of their screen game things they like to do there, but he's been more or less good to go. Mo Blackwell, kind of a dime linebacker. He's someone who, plays situationally, but he's been good to go. So outside of Kelvin Banks right now, we haven't heard of anybody who may be facing injury. And of course, the latest SEC availability report reflected as much.
All right, let's say things go well for Texas on Saturday. They have a chance to win this game. What do you think that looks like? What do the Longhorns have to accomplish to have a chance at extracting a little revenge on Georgia and walking away as SEC champs?
It's three things for me, Jordan. One, they're going to have to play, quite frankly, much better in terms of the offensive efficiency. We talked about it. Of course, I want to freaking sneeze here as we're doing this. All right, that's the magic of doing a live show. Nevertheless, excuse me, they got to perform better in the field position game, right? That's step one. Their offense in terms of the efficiency, even if, and that was the thing, Jordan, that Oklahoma game, Oklahoma had opportunities in that first quarter because Texas's offense, very similar to the Georgia game, gave them short fields. But as we talk about, Oklahoma's offense hasn't been great this year. At least find ways to flip the field. That's one of the things where, Georgia's punter Thorson, I thought, did a great job. I think he had 3 punts of 50 yards or more, 2 that landed inside the 20-yard line. Texas, rolling with a true freshman punter in Michael Kern, didn't exactly, his average, and I want to say his net is 38, 39 yards. So hasn't been doing a great job flip the field. So Texas, at least if you're not going to score points, you got to advance the ball a little bit and be a little more efficient on offense. That's step one. Step two, the running game has to continue, and it has to look the way it did. This is not a game in my mind where you can expect to have, all right, we're going to, go 1 yard a pop, 2 yards a pop, get a 40-yard chunk play, and then all of a sudden that's going to put us in position to kind of finish off the drives as it had been the early part of the year. I don't think that's something that you can expect. I don't think that's a formula for success. Being able to run the ball, again, it's not necessarily going to look like 200 and something yards against Georgia. If they do that, then Texas is going to, win this game decidedly. But if, in terms of sack adjusted yards, if Texas is at 130, 140, 150, and they're able to get those yards consistently, establish it early in the game, come back to it late in the game to finish, I think that's going to be huge. And the third thing I think is forcing turnovers. Texas's offense, again, very potent. They've performed well at times. However, they have had, and I'd look, further in the Arkansas game, for example, where they take a little time to find their footing. This isn't the Texas offense of, early in the season or even the last year where, all right, they're going to come out, get their points, and they're going to take care of business, right? They haven't shown that consistently. If Texas's offense does struggle in the early going to put up points, the defense is going to have to give them additional opportunities to create points. So I do think it's going to be crucial that the Longhorns can force at least one turnover, if not multiple.
Yeah, the turnover battle will surely play a big factor in how this game plays out. And speaking of how this game plays out, Eric, what do you think we see on Saturday? And give me a score prediction on who winds up winning the SEC.
Again, I have waffled on this throughout the week, right? I've gone back and forth, because I'm just wondering. It'd be one thing if Georgia played their A game and, kind of squeaked out that victory. I shouldn't say squeaked out because obviously it was decidedly Georgia in the first half, and then Texas had to try to claw their way back. But it'd been one thing if that was their A game. That wasn't, right? I have to believe a Kirby Smart coach team is going to find a way to clean up some mistakes and clean up some inefficiencies on their end and play a much better brand of football. But I do believe that if both teams are playing their best game from what I've seen this year, or at least closest to it, that Texas has enough firepower to win this game. I see this something, I know you went 24-23 when we exchanged Q&As. I'm going to go something like, Jordan, I fell in that trap a couple times this year where I was like, all right, this is the game that Texas's defense is going to allow more than 20, and it's bit me in the behind. So I'm going to go something like 17-14, 17-10 on that end of things. I think it'll be a defensive spearheaded, a victory that'd be spearheaded by the defense. But again, it's one that I think will go more as far as a low scoring affair than anything else.
And that's Texas winning.
And that's Texas winning, yes.
I've also got Texas, as Eric mentioned, 24-23. The way they're running the ball, again, I mentioned this earlier in the show, the fact Christian Miller's probably not going to play, I think that is a huge loss for a run defense that even when Christian Miller was healthy was very hit or miss. The wide receivers for Georgia have really been struggling with not only drops, they lead the nation in drops, but in the Georgia Tech game, really struggled with separation, getting open. I think this is going to be a very tight game. I think it's going to be back and forth, but there's just too much about Texas that makes me think that Georgia can win it, can sweep Texas, go 2-0 against them. But like Eric said, if that's how this plays out, if Texas wins, I mean, and maybe even if that's not the case and Georgia wins, we're probably seeing these two teams again. I do think that they are two of the teams that are best positioned and are talented enough to go out here and win this 12-team playoff.
No, again, it's one of those things that it's so hard, and you kind of alluded to it in your end, to beat a team of this caliber twice. That's just such a tough ask to me. That's part of why I lean towards Texas. And who knows? Again, if this is a trilogy, then hopefully we get a slugfest come Saturday, and then the third meeting can really kind of decide this game, this kind of series. But in my mind, again, it's so hard to beat a team of this caliber twice, and that's really why I lean towards Texas.
Couple of scores from the Dogs 24/7 staff. Ben Wolk has Georgia 27-24. That was actually the score that Alabama won by in the SEC title game last December. And Kip's feeling pretty confident. He's got Georgia 30-20. So we're kind of all over the board over at Dogs 24/7. But I do think this is going to be a very competitive game. I think it's going to be a fun watch in Atlanta on Saturday afternoon. Eric, I want to thank you for popping on. I'll give you an opportunity. Please plug anything you're working on, anywhere that folks can follow you, and how they can get ready to watch the Longhorns play the Bulldogs again.
Yeah, Jordan, as always, appreciate you having me on. Of course, you can find my Texas football coverage as part of the 24/7 Sports Network at Horns 24/7. Chip Brown and I do a weekly podcast called the Flagship Podcast. You can find that Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m., just like you're watching this. Be up on Horns 24/7 Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. Let's see, where else can you find me? Texas Sports Unfiltered, everything else. I mean, it feels like I'm working on 9 different things, but keep us locked into, both Dogs 24/7 and Horns 24/7. Got still plenty more content that we're working on between now and Saturday morning.
Yeah, it's been a busy week, like you said, with National Signing Day, but definitely a lot of good content on the Texas side and the Georgia side. Did want to shout out before we ended this episode, rest in peace, Bob Holt. I don't know, Eric, if you ever had a chance to interact with Bob from the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, passed away on Wednesday night. Absolute legend. One of the best parts of SEC Media Days, he was always usually getting the first question, and he always was an entertaining person to be around. Very sad to see that news. And I think that they're going to wind up having a moment of silence for the first question when we get to Media Days next year. But I know y'all are new to the conference, Eric, but I don't know if you ever interacted with Bob, but he was certainly one of one.
I had a brief interaction with him this year, just amongst a group of us kind of talking about each other's respective teams. And, like I think you said it really well, just, condolences to his family and loved ones, and he definitely will be missed. And I do remember him, being there all 3 days, getting that first question. And so I think it's certainly fitting that we leave that one silent for him.
Absolutely. A legend, no doubt about it. Well, we will wrap it up right there. Again, thanks to everyone who watched us live, everyone who is watching or listening to this after the fact. Thanks again to Eric for popping on, taking some time during a very busy week. Make sure and subscribe to Dogs 24/7, Horns 24/7 if you're a Texas fan, YouTube, TikTok, all kinds of good stuff with Dogs 24/7, with Georgia football and men's basketball rolling right along. So we will end it there. For Eric Henry, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.